The loudest moment that night wasn't a bang. It was a pause. A single mechanical click that cut through a crowded room and rewrote the balance of power in Harlem. In that fraction of a second, everyone understood something had gone wrong and that it wasn't going to be fixed with violence. The man sitting at the table was Bumpy Johnson, and the man standing behind him wasn't an enemy in the usual sense. He was trusted, protected, family by proximity. That's what made the moment so dangerous. When power is challenged from the outside, you can see it coming. When it comes from behind, it's already late. For years, the mob had tried everything to remove Bumpy Johnson from Harlem. Pressure, money, politics, none of it worked. By the late 1950 seconds, there was only one option left: turn the person closest to him and end it quietly. No war, no retaliation. One shot, one body, problem solved. At least, that was the theory. What nobody in that room knew was that the outcome had already been decided long before the trigger was pulled. The plan didn't fail because of bad luck. It failed because it was seen, measured, and absorbed into a larger design. That's the difference between reacting to danger and controlling it. This story isn't about a gun that didn't fire. It's about why it didn't matter, about how betrayal can be turned into evidence, and how exposing a threat can be more powerful than eliminating it. What happened next didn't just save one man's life, it forced an entire criminal ecosystem to rethink how power actually works. Because in Harlem, that night proved something brutal and permanent. Real authority doesn't flinch when the trigger is pulled. It waits for the sound and decides what it means. By the late 1950 seconds, Bumpy Johnson wasn't fighting rivals anymore. He was managing inevitability. Harlem's numbers racket was stable. The community trusted him, and every outside attempt to muscle in had failed. That's when pressure changes shape. When force can't break a system, it looks for a seam inside it. For the Italian families, the math was simple. You don't challenge a man who controls the streets through respect. You remove him quietly and let the structure collapse on its own. No shootouts, no headlines, no retaliation cycle. Just one person who could get close enough to make it final. The only problem was finding someone who lived close enough to the target to make suspicion irrelevant. That's why bodyguards become the last lever. They're invisible by design. Their presence is normal, expected, unquestioned. They stand where no enemy ever could behind the chair, within arm's length, inside routines that never change. Turning a bodyguard doesn't just create an opening, it erases warning. This is the point most stories miss. Betrayal at this level isn't about greed alone. It's about isolation. You pressure the man who can't step away. You apply weight where loyalty hurts the most family needs, medical bills, the promise of an exit that sounds like mercy. The offer isn't framed as treason, it's framed as relief. What made the move dangerous wasn't the weapon. It was plausibility. No one would question a bodyguard approaching his boss. No one would react until it was over. That's why the plan looked perfect on paper. And that's also why it failed in practice. Because Bumpy didn't protect himself by assuming loyalty was permanent. He protected himself by assuming loyalty was conditional. He watched patterns, not promises. He paid attention to who was under pressure, who was tired, who had reasons not to sleep. Long before the trigger was pulled, the danger had already announced itself in smaller ways. When the threat comes from behind, survival isn't about reflexes, it's about foresight. And the moment the Italians decided to buy proximity instead of confronting power, they stepped onto a board that had already been mapped. They thought they were setting a trap. In reality, they were walking into one. The most dangerous lies are the ones that sound practical. Nobody tells a man to betray for greed alone. They tell him it's temporary, necessary, just one step to protect the people he loves. That's how loyalty gets reframed, not as a virtue, but as a liability. And once that shift happens, everything becomes negotiable. For Bumpy Johnson, this wasn't theory. It was pattern recognition. He'd seen it before men who didn't wake up wanting to betray anyone, but who went to sleep every night calculating what loyalty was costing them. Illness, debt, fear of a future that promised nothing but more risk. Pressure doesn't break people all at once. It narrows their choices until only one looks survivable. That's why loyalty is always the first target in any serious power struggle. You don't attack the strongest part of a system head-on. You weaken the human links holding it together. A bodyguard isn't just muscle, he's routine. Trust. The quiet assumption that some dangers don't need to be watched because they're already handled. Turning that role turns the entire architecture upside down. The Italians understood this perfectly. They didn't need hatred. They needed leverage. And leverage works best when it feels personal. Family emergencies, medical bills, promises of safety that sound like rescue instead of extortion. The offer isn't framed as killing your boss, it's framed as saving your family. Once that framing takes hold, the moral weight shifts and the decision starts justifying itself. But here's what makes this story different. Bumpy never confused loyalty with blindness. He knew that devotion without support decays. That's why he paid attention to stress before it became betrayal. He watched the pauses, the changes in routine, the small fractures that appear when someone is carrying more than they can admit. Loyalty, in Bumpy's world, wasn't a slogan. It was a system that required maintenance. When someone stopped believing the system would protect them, the danger wasn't the person, it was the gap that formed around them. The Italians thought they were exploiting a weakness. What they didn't realize was that the weakness had already been accounted for and turned into part of the plan. What separated Bumpy Johnson from everyone trying to remove him was simple. He never waited for proof. Proof arrives too late. He worked on indicators, small movements that signaled pressure before it turned into action, a change in routine, a hesitation where confidence used to live, silence where there had once been conversation. Information didn't come from lieutenants or meetings. It came from the background, people no one ever looked at twice. Men who parked cars, wiped bars, ran errands, and noticed who stopped where, for how long, and with whom. The Italians underestimated that layer because they didn't value it. They believed power moved top-down. Bumpy knew it moved sideways. By the time an offer was being discussed, the fact that an offer existed was already known. Not the details, not the amount, just the direction. That was enough. When pressure appears in a system, it always leaves a wake. You don't need to hear the conversation if you can see the effects. This is where most leaders make the wrong move. They confront too early. They demand explanations. They force denials that lock everyone into positions. Bumpy did the opposite. He waited. Waiting wasn't hesitation, it was verification. Letting the situation mature revealed intent more clearly than interrogation ever could. The goal wasn't to catch someone thinking about betrayal. Thoughts can be explained away. The goal was to see whether they would commit. Commitment removes ambiguity. It creates a moment that can't be revised or reinterpreted. And once that moment happens in public, it stops being personal and becomes structural. That's why Bumpy didn't stop the plan. He redirected it. He allowed events to move forward under controlled conditions, with the outcome already decided. In doing so, he turned a private threat into a public lesson, one that couldn't be denied, spun, or quietly forgotten. Power at this level isn't about shutting doors. It's about deciding which ones are allowed to open and how far. By the time the trigger was pulled, the decision-making phase was already over. What remained wasn't danger. It was demonstration. At the moment when exposure became certainty, Bumpy Johnson faced a choice that separates survivors from strategists. He could erase the problem quietly, end the threat before it spoke, before it echoed. That path was familiar, effective, and final. It also would have solved the wrong problem. Killing a traitor closes a door. It doesn't explain why the door existed. Bumpy understood that the Italian families weren't testing his reflexes. They were testing his system. They wanted to know whether loyalty in Harlem could be bought, whether pressure could fracture the structure without a war. If he responded with a disappearance, the question would remain unanswered. Rumors would multiply. Doubt would linger. Another approach would come, subtler and smarter. So he chose restraint not as mercy, but as leverage, by allowing the plan to reach its visible moment and fail on its own terms. Bumpy transformed a private conspiracy into a public verdict. No speech could have done that. No retaliation could have clarified it better. Everyone in the room saw the same thing at the same time. Proximity had been weaponized and neutralized without bloodshed. The system held. This is the calculus most people miss. Violence can end an attempt, but it can also validate the strategy behind it. If a bodyguard dies, the lesson for outsiders is simple. Try again with someone else. If a bodyguard stands exposed alive, known, and corrected, the lesson becomes permanent. This avenue is closed. Restraint also protected the city. A killing would have forced alignments, demanded responses, and pulled Harlem into a cycle it didn't need. By choosing a consequence that corrected behavior without igniting chaos, Bumpy preserved order while tightening control. The streets didn't panic. They recalibrated. And there was another layer. Letting the moment stand ensured the message traveled farther than a rumor ever could. The witness count mattered. The setting mattered. The calm mattered. Power didn't need to explain itself because it had been demonstrated. In that decision, Bumpy did something rarer than survival. He made the attack obsolete. He showed that even the most intimate betrayal couldn't bypass foresight, and that the most effective response isn't always the loudest one. Sometimes, the strongest move is to let the plan fail publicly and make sure everyone understands why it never had a chance. When the trigger was pulled and nothing happened, the room learned a lesson faster than any speech could deliver. That sound, short, hollow, unmistakable, did more damage to the opposition than a gunshot ever could. In a space filled with witnesses, the failure wasn't technical. It was structural. The plan didn't misfire. It collapsed. For Bumpy Johnson, the value of that moment wasn't survival. It was transmission. 300 people heard the same click and reached the same conclusion at the same time. The most intimate form of betrayal had been anticipated and neutralized. No spin, no alternative explanation. The evidence existed in shared memory. That's why the aftermath didn't require enforcement. There were no immediate crackdowns, no dramatic reshuffling of crews. People adjusted on their own. Meetings changed tone. Approaches were reconsidered. The idea that you could buy access to Harlem's core evaporated overnight. The avenue had been tested publicly and found closed. The sound mattered because it removed ambiguity. Violence creates narratives, arguments about who fired first, who deserved what, who escalated. A click creates certainty. Everyone understands failure. Everyone understands exposure. And everyone understands that trying again would only repeat the humiliation at a higher cost. The Italians understood it too. Their strategy depended on deniability and distance. This had neither. The plan had surfaced, been allowed to breathe, and then been extinguished without blood. That meant no retaliation could restore leverage. Any response would only confirm that the move had been seen and beaten. Inside Harlem, the effect was stabilizing. Fear didn't spike. Confidence did. The system had been stress-tested at its most vulnerable point and held. That kind of proof travels quickly and lasts a long time. It tells allies they're protected and warns rivals that creativity won't save them. History often remembers the loud moments, the shots, the chases, the funerals. But power shifts on quieter cues. A pause, a misfire, a room realizing all at once that the outcome was decided before the action began. That click didn't echo because it was loud. It echoed because it was final. History remembers violence because it leaves marks, but the moments that actually change outcomes are quieter, cleaner, and far more permanent. The night a bodyguard pulled the trigger behind Bumpy Johnson, nothing exploded, and that's exactly why everything shifted. The plan didn't fail because of luck. It failed because it was already obsolete. The sound that mattered wasn't a gunshot. It was the realization spreading through the room that the most intimate betrayal imaginable had been seen, allowed, and neutralized without blood. In that pause, power revealed itself as something different from force, something predictive, patient, and absolute. By choosing restraint over erasure, Bumpy closed an entire category of attack. He didn't just survive an assassination attempt. He proved that buying loyalty in Harlem was no longer a viable strategy. Rivals didn't retreat out of fear of retaliation. They retreated because the math no longer worked. The board had been read, the trap exposed, the outcome decided before anyone moved. That's the lesson this story leaves behind. Guns end lives. Foresight ends wars. When authority is confident enough to let a plan fail publicly, it doesn't need to threaten again. The city recalibrates on its own. Allies feel protected, enemies feel seen, and the rules harden without being announced. Bumpy Johnson didn't need to raise his voice or spill blood to secure his position. He needed witnesses, timing, and the discipline to let silence do the work. The clique became a boundary one that told everyone exactly where Harlem stood and who understood it best. In the end, power wasn't proven by pulling the trigger. It was proven by knowing what would happen when it was pulled and choosing to let the world hear the answer.